If you have a true scary story you'd like to hear featured on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. I have a story that was seriously the most terrifying thing to ever happen to me. I used to work the closing shift of a pizza place. I was a delivery driver, and they closed at midnight. The drivers were expected to help clean up the restaurant at close, so I would usually get out at around 1 or so. After work, I would always go to this little gas station / convenience store that was open 24 hours, and most of the times that I went, the front counter was being worked by a guy named Dan. Dan was a 50-something-year-old man that really didn't seem to have much going for him, but he was friendly enough that I was able to have a decent conversation with him each time I would visit. The thing about this convenience store, they only had one person working each overnight shift from the hours of midnight to around 5 in the morning. Obviously, this wasn't ideal and was a huge security risk for the store and that person in general. Because of this, and because they expected to get a bit more foot traffic this summer, they had installed what was basically a buzzer system. After 10 p.m., the cashier had to hit the button to unlock the front door for the person that was outside, and this seemed like it was safe enough. Basically, Dan could decide if he wanted to let someone in the store or not, though he was told to let everyone in that wasn't wearing your stereotypical robber attire. On the night that this event happened, I worked a bit later than normal because we were really busy at the store, so we had a lot of dishes that we needed to do. Because it was almost 2 in the morning, I decided that I would go get some caffeine and then head home to play a game for a few hours. My sleep schedule was already screwed up, so I figured why not just pull an all-nighter. I pulled up to the store. Dan saw me and waved me in before hitting the buzzer. I walked in and asked him how he was doing, just making small talk and asking about the night. He told me that I was late, and I told him about how busy the restaurant was. Basically, we just made some really banter-filled small talk about nothing in particular. After a few minutes, I saw a man walk toward the counter from around where the drink freezer was, and I told Dan that I would let him get back to work while I went to get my monster. The man that approached the counter looked a bit raggedy, and I'm not trying to be insulting, he just kind of looked like he may have been homeless. He was wearing a large jacket in the middle of July and was also wearing a ski cap on top of his head. Being the summer, I could only imagine that he was incredibly uncomfortable in the heat. I turned to walk away from the counter and get my drink when I heard Dan say, "Oh, just the water this evening?" And then the man started screaming something at him. I turned around to see what the hell was going on, and I realized what he was yelling. The homeless-looking guy was yelling, "Give me the money," and pointing a gun straight at Dan's head. As soon as he realized I was looking at him, he pointed the gun at me and told me to get behind the counter. I put my hands up and complied, walking back behind the counter and standing with my back to the wall. He keeps yelling at Dan to give him the money or else he would kill us both. Dan was scrambling and struggling to open the register. I think the nerves were beating the crap out of him, and for some reason, he couldn't think about what button to press to get it open. The whole time he's scrambling to press the buttons, this guy is pushing the gun into his forehead and screaming that he had 5 seconds before he pulled the trigger. Dan pushed the button and put his hands up, then the register shot open. The man grabbed all the cash from the drawer and immediately took off toward the front door. He went to push it open, but of course it wouldn't open because it had to be buzzed open. After a couple of seconds of him trying to get it open, he stepped back and shot the door several times, causing the glass to shatter, then booked it. Thankfully, while fumbling over the register, Dan had pressed the button on the register to set off the silent alarm. A few minutes after the man had taken off, the police pulled up with their guns drawn and then ran into the store. We told the officers about the man and told him which way he went. One of the officers got back in the car and started driving around the block to find the guy. The officers took statements from both of us and asked us to watch the camera footage so they could get a visual of the guy. They did the whole thing they normally did, dusting for prints, got the footage, and took our information so that they could call us if necessary. Obviously, I was panicking inside, and Dan was freaking out too. He called the owner and told him that he needed to come out and figure out what to do about the door. Then when he got off the phone with him, he told me to go get my drink and get out of there. I went and got my energy drink, though I'm pretty sure I could have just stayed awake on pure adrenaline. And when I went to pay, he told me that it was on him that night. I nodded and left. After all this was said and done, I actually found out that this wasn't the guy's first robbery. It wasn't even his first robbery that night. Apparently, the little convenience store was actually the third spot that he had hit that night. The first store he robbed was a grocery store on the other side of the state line, and the second was another gas station that was about 20 minutes north of us. The thing is, at the other gas station, he had actually shot the clerk because he wouldn't cooperate. The guy wasn't killed because he shot him in the shoulder, but he was obviously injured pretty badly. He wasn't actually homeless, and he was only using that as a disguise to make himself look larger than he was and harder to identify. Since he had hit 2 other places that night, the police were actually pretty heavy out on the streets, which is why they got there so quick when they did. And they actually caught the guy a few blocks up the road where he was getting into his getaway car. It was seriously terrifying to be a bystander in this robbery. And considering he had shot the other clerk, I can imagine that if Dan had any more trouble with the register, he likely would have shot him too. It scares the hell out of me to consider how close our lives came to their ends, but I'm thankful that it ended without casualties. After this happened, the store decided that they would just close for the overnight shift for a while, and I decided that after work, I would just go straight home. It could have been much, much worse for sure, but it was still the scariest thing to ever happen to me. So the wonderful Walmart was my first real job. I started working there shortly after graduating high school and continued to for a little over 3 years. I was younger, as mentioned, right out of high school, so maybe a little naive and didn't run into many serious conflicts, so I didn't know how to react to some situations. But I quickly learned. Walmart makes you grow up pretty fast as an employee. I'm sure others will relate to that. I bring this up because of these 2 memorable experiences I encountered during my time working there. The first one was about a year into me working there. A young child around a year old in a neighboring city had gone missing. There was a lot of speculation around the whole situation, from the mother being suspicious and even cadaver dogs alerting authorities to specific spots in their home, but sadly, they never found anything on their property or any evidence to make an arrest at that time. This case was always fresh in my mind as I worked the early shift and heard about it on the news every morning before I left for work. I was a cashier, and I also worked at the customer service desk on occasions. I see a lot of people coming in with their kids, and most of the younger ones that are in the cart like to watch the bag carousel as it spins. Sometimes they talk to me and their parents always smile and try to be part of the conversation as well, especially with smaller babies that can't talk, but they smile and laugh, so it makes for a good time. On one occasion, though, I had an older lady come in with a small infant. The woman looked old enough to be the grandparent to this child. Now, of course, this wasn't an unusual situation, but something just felt off. When she first pulled into my checkout lane, she was focused on this child, smiling. I greeted her and she started putting stuff on the belt. She bought a lot of clothes, a baby mattress, diaper, formula, and toys. I thought it was a bit odd for the amount. I've seen grandparents, friends, aunts, etc. bring in a small child and buy them an outfit or a toy or something, but never a full wardrobe. But maybe the parents were a little down on their luck and she was helping them out? But still, the kid was small, but she definitely looked too old to still be on formula alone, but that was the only type of food she bought. Other than the item she bought, she didn't talk much and she would not take the child out of her sight. After sitting down every item, she would look up at the baby. Once she pulled the cart up to the carousel, I looked over at her to see if maybe the kid looked upset or was being playful or something, but she just looked around and looked at me. You know that look infants give when they are confused or scared right before they burst out crying? That's kind of what she looked like. She just looked like she didn't know what was going on. The woman, now waiting on me to finish ringing everything up, is staring at this child again, rubbing her head, smiling, but not saying anything to her. Once I finish ringing everything up, I try to put the items back in her cart, and she stopped me quickly by saying, "It's okay, I got it, don't worry about it," which was a little weird. Rarely people stop me from putting their groceries in their cart, but I let it go. She gave me a credit card to pay, and at the time, our machines did ask for ID if they used a credit card and the amount was over a certain limit. When I asked for her ID, she became flustered and started looking around her purse for it. After a few seconds, she asked to pay in cash instead, which she then pulled out a wad of bills. I completed the order and she started leaving so quick, she almost forgot a bag and her receipt. So after she left, my line was empty again. It was around 6 or 7 in the morning, so we were really slow at that time. When this happens, I start to straighten out my lane where all the impulse items were, including the magazines. That's when I looked over at the magazine covers to see the face of the missing baby when I realized why that encounter was so off to me. That baby looked just like the missing one that has been on the news lately. She had the bright green eyes and the light curly hair that was starting to grow. She was from a city less than 30 minutes from where I was too. The part that started worrying me more was that this child looked confused. She didn't look like she was particularly happy or comforted by seeing this woman, but she also wasn't crying or screaming. Another thing was that the missing child had a birthmark on the back of her neck. Could that be why this woman didn't want me to go to the back of the cart to see the back of the baby's head? Obviously, this didn't dawn on me at the time, so I didn't even look at her to check. Then there was the fact that she was also so worried about showing her ID and wanted to leave so quickly. Both of these were very suspicious. Lastly, the items she bought were just too much to be as a random gift. Of course, this was all me speculating, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I just let someone go that could have been related to this case. It's been well over 10 years now since that case, and this child still has not been found. I can only hope it was unfortunate coincidences, but part of me still wonders what could have happened if I reported this. The second experience was something that continued through the last year that I worked there. I will say I am a female, 18 to 20 years old at the time, so it was a normal thing to have both men and women call me sweetie, honey, baby, etc. Most of the time, it was fine. Usually the older people, so no harm done. Every once in a while, I would get an older guy that may call me beautiful, but I just moved on. However, this guy was more persistent. First time he came through my line, he says, "Well, good morning, beautiful." I smiled and said good morning back, asking him how he was, normal small talk. This guy was older too, like old enough to be my grandfather. I know this not only by the way he looks, but he even makes that comment. He even went as far to say something about, "You wouldn't want to be with someone like me, not at my age." By the end of his purchase, I hand him his receipt and he holds out his hand to shake mine. Kind of weird, but I held it out. He put his other hand over mine like he was cupping it, and as he looks at my name badge, he says something about, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Marie. See you next time." I again smile and say, "Same to you, have a good day," and I move on with my day. Not only a few hours later, this guy is back and in my line. He is literally only buying a soda from one of the small cases right up front by the registers. I remembered this because I thought, why go to a Walmart for a single soda when you could have just gone to a gas station or something? When it was his turn, he said, "Well, we meet again." And I just smiled and made a comment about, "Miss me that much?" To my surprise, he said, "Yes, actually." It was awkward as he tried to make small talk, but we were busy at that point, so he was trying to stand next to my register and talk while I'm still ringing up other customers. I think he finally took the hint that I couldn't really talk, so he just said, "Well, I'll let you get back to work. Good night, Marie," and left. This guy was already making me feel weird when he said my name, but I did my best to ignore it. Sadly, this continued, as mentioned, for months. He would be there several times a week, and he would always end up in my line buying random things. He even tried to buy a box of Valentine candies, and afterwards, as I handed him the bag, he said they were for me, for his Valentine. I, of course, refused it. I told him I could not take gifts from customers, and I also was happily taken. Now, that seemed to upset him a bit. He made a comment about how it was rude to not accept a gift in his religion, and that he wanted to speak to my manager to convince them to let me have it. I finally got a manager, and they insisted that I could not take it. He finally accepted that answer, but said he wanted to return it and get a refund. I remember him throwing a fit because he had to go to customer service instead of through me to do so he just left with it. At this point, I told my manager about this guy and how he made me feel so uncomfortable. They said if it's ever too much to call them over, and they will switch me out so I don't ring him up. I thought that was fair and left it at that. This night in particular, my fiance had to take me to work and pick me up because of car issues. As I was leaving the store for the night, my fiance was actually walking in when I noticed the creepy guy was sitting on a bench by the carts, and of course, he noticed me. So, as he started getting up, I was close enough that I did a fast walk to my fiance and hugged him, making it very obvious to this guy. He saw this and just stared at me. So we walked around the store and I told him about the guy, and he agreed that if he was going to start sitting out there or causing any more problems like that, then he would just park and come in to walk me out to the car until we felt it was safe again. Sadly, this did not stop that guy. I never saw him waiting around by the doors anymore, but he would continue to show up around the store and try to go in my lane. He would make it there sometimes, and he was never short on questions to ask me about my personal life, but I never gave him any answers. If anything, they were vague. But still, he didn't stop. When they would switch me out though, he would holler at me as I was walking away from the register, saying things like, "Where are you going? I miss you. Are they doing this to us on purpose?" Like we were a thing or something. It was awful, and he started making me dread coming to work. I even felt bad for one cashier as she was swapping out with me, and he was one behind the current customer. He lost it. He started laying into this cashier, calling her so many awful names and slamming the items down on the belt. I went and told my manager before I went and hid for a while, and I think he was told to calm down or he would be told to leave. They rarely banned or kicked people out. It was always just empty threats. I was so happy though when I was finally transferred to customer service, as I hardly saw him after that. I would occasionally see him passing by and he would wave at me, but at that point, I stopped caring and wouldn't even acknowledge him. I don't know if I just blanked him out that much or if he moved on to someone else, but thankfully, I didn't see him the last few months that I worked there. I have a story that happened to me and my wife back in July of 1998. We were both fairly young. I think I was 22 at the time, which would have made her 23. The two of us had moved away pretty much as soon as we could and had made a comfortable life for ourselves about 3 states away from where we grew up. Of course, this meant, and still does mean, that we have to fly back home anytime something important or worthy of celebrating happens to our family. Well, in this particular year, my sister was getting married, and she wanted to have her wedding on July 3rd, which would mean that our whole family would be there to celebrate on July 4th. Normally, we hadn't flown back on the 4th, but because my sister was getting married, we were pretty much told that it was important to do so. So we packed our bags and got ready for the trip back home. We had, of course, decided that flying would be our preferred method of travel, as neither one of us wanted to spend a ton of time driving across the Midwest. This was also pre-2001, so flying was a bit more laid back, and there wasn't a ton of security to make the event stressful. We got to the airport and parked the car, then got into the building, got our luggage checked, and went through the basic security checks to get out to the lobby area where the gates are. By the time we were there and ready, we still had about an hour and a half before our flight, so we decided to just kind of hang out. Again, 1998, so we didn't have phones or a laptop to kill time with, unfortunately. About 30 minutes into us sitting there, I started to doze off, and my wife was pretty much nose down into the book she was reading when I heard a man saying something that I couldn't quite make out. I then heard my wife respond to him, and this made me jump up from my half asleep to fully awake. When I opened my eyes and sat up, I think I kind of startled the guy because he sort of jumped a bit too. When he noticed I was awake, he seemed to no longer be interested in standing in front of us and kind of just shuffled away. It was weird, but I kind of laughed and then looked over to her and asked what he wanted. She said that he asked her if she knew how to fly a plane, and when she said no, he said that he could teach her if she was interested, and apparently that was the entirety of the conversation. I said all right, and then decided that it wasn't worth too much more attention and that I would get back to my nap. No more than 15 minutes or so later, there was an announcement over the speakers at the airport that was asking everyone to remain where they were and stated that there was a situation that was being dealt with. They then stated that this may cause delays and apologized for the inconvenience. It was a bit strange for an announcement to be made to the entire airport, but I just assumed there was something going on with the systems or air control or something like that. We still had at least half an hour until we got on the plane, so I wasn't too terribly worried about the whole thing. That is, until about 5 minutes or so later, when the police showed up, and it wasn't just 1 or 2 officers. It looked like it was the entire police department for the county. They were all wearing what looked like tactical gear, and several of them had their big guns. And they were sweeping the floor asking people for ID and to see their tickets. Most people were checked and then told to go to the other end of the lobby, and that was that. However, a few of us were checked and then told to wait by the opposite wall while they finished the sweep. Then, when they got those of us against the second wall, they started pulling us away and asking us strange questions. They actually pulled myself and my wife apart before they started talking to us. I remember the questions seemed incredibly strange at the time. The first thing the officer asked me was for my full name and address, then asked where I was going. I told him everything and said where we were going, and he started asking me why we were headed there, who we were going to see, just a ton of really personal questions about our trip. Then he asked me if I was aware of what was going on, and I told him I had no idea. He then asked if I had spoken to anyone in the airport while I was there. At first, I told him no, but then I mentioned that some random guy came up and asked my wife if she knew how to fly a plane. He nodded at my answer and then told me to go ahead and get back with the group. Around the same time, they had finished asking my wife what was going on as well, and she went back to the wall. This was pretty much where we stayed for another hour, which put us as late for takeoff on your flight, but no one was able to go anywhere. The officers had put the entire airport on what was essentially a lockdown. A little while after that, the announcement came back through and mentioned that we all needed to go to our gates and that they would begin boarding specific flights and taking off as soon as possible. We got to our gate and waited as every other flight seemed to be boarding but ours. Then we pretty much found out why our flight wasn't going anywhere and why the police were scrutinizing us more than the others. As we were sitting there, several officers came through the boarding area from where our plane was sitting, and they were basically carrying the man from earlier, the one that asked my wife about flying the plane. He was screaming incoherently as they took him out of the tunnel thing and out of the airport altogether. Obviously, that was a bit strange. None of us had been able to board, so him being on the plane was a bit odd. After they had gotten him out of the airport, and as they were wrapping the scene up, I actually stopped one of the officers and asked him what exactly happened. Thankfully, he was actually one of the cops that had questioned me, so he was willing to tell me. He said that this guy had somehow gotten past the security people at the gate and managed to get into the plane when only the pilots were on. He then started trying to break down the door to the captain's area, saying that he needed to get in so he could fly the plane because he needed to teach his new girlfriend. Obviously, they got on call with security immediately, but then they asked him about who his friend was and where he was flying to. He told them that it was the pretty lady he met in the airport. This would be why they were asking my wife and I about the whole thing. My guess is that they saw us talking to him on the security cameras and wanted to make sure we weren't in on some plot to hijack a plane. Thankfully, the guy seemed to be completely nuts. So once we gave them our info and both told them that we didn't know the guy that was talking to us, they were happy with it and determined that he was acting alone. That was pretty much the end of it. The officers stayed at the airport until all the passengers were on the plane, and we took off as normal without any issues. We were about an hour late getting in, but that really wasn't a big deal, especially since we had one hell of a story to tell the family. So that, my friends, was another scary story collection. All of these scary in their own ways, but it was a little weird with the Walmart one because I did work for Walmart for a couple of years, and being that they use the name Marie, weird. If you've worked in retail, we've probably all had those weird customers, right? I know I did, especially working at Walmart, and Raven knows about them too. So yeah, I can definitely sympathize with that person. So thank you, and I'm sorry. But man, flying alone makes me nervous. But having somebody come up and say that, I think I would just not know. You know what? Never mind. We don't need to fly. I will drive. That's fine. And that's it. Anyways, if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing. You can also follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you prefer to call it. Sometimes I post random things on there. Sometimes it's just story notifications in case you don't want to turn on notifications through YouTube. You know, whichever one you prefer. And last, of course, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts on the video, your thoughts on the day, the week, how you're feeling, or what's the one game on your phone that you can't seem to stop playing. I know you have games on your phone. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.